Hello, friends. How are you tonight? Hello, Dolores on Facebook. Hello, Carmen. Carmen says Saturdays with Bonnie and Joe feels like being with family. Hi, all. Hi, Dolores on YouTube. Kay says thank you, Dolores Pierce. No notice tonight again. Shake my head. FB sucks for me. Carmen says being, not bring. Autocorrect got me again. Crap, and that's a typo. Kay says hi, Joe. Hi, Kay. Glad you're here. Thank you. Please share, folks. So I hope tonight is not going to be too much of a downer. Okay, it's a warning. Let's start with a piece from Truth Out. COVID isn't over. The U.S. must do more to combat it. Worldwide, this is a man touching the coffin of his relative COVID-19 on June 1st, 2021 in Lima, Peru. This is by William Rivers Pitt. I was asked to take my mask off for the first time yesterday. Well, that's not quite accurate. Better to say I was invited to remove my mask. Yes, when I popped into my local bodega. Yes, we have bodegas in New Hampshire. The counterman was all smiles when he said it, maskless himself. The store was empty and I didn't want to seem rude, so off it came, and it felt for all the world like I was standing there without pants. I've been fully vaxxed for a while now, but I still wear a mask when I'm going to be around people. Part of it is habit at this point. Part of it is an act of solidarity with those who have to wear them. And part of it is the fact that I haven't had so much as a case of the sniffles since I started wearing one. Come winter, and no matter the current COVID circumstances, a mask will continue to be part of my accessorizing for that reason alone, and I'll bet you a buck I won't be the only one. The tissue companies are going to take a hit. God, the masks are a symbol for the age. If I live another 50 years, I will never escape a feeling of melancholic anger whenever I see one. Every one of them should have, quote, it didn't have to be this way, unquote, stamped on the front. They represent death, injury, failure, and fear to me. And one thing more, they're a reminder that a stunningly large portion of this country won't do a damn thing to help anyone else if it involves being mildly inconvenienced, even if it makes the difference between life and death. That's the glass half empty and cracked perspective, which probably isn't entirely fair. Millions and millions of people took mask wearing to heart to help themselves and their neighbors, and our stratospheric infection numbers have sharply declined. More than half the country over the age of 12 has gotten at least one shot, which is also serving to put a lid on new cases. Those cases are still emerging every day by the thousands, but the difference between now and last winter is both staggering and heartening. After an unendurably protracted run of months stuffed to bursting with death and sorrow, we're finally heading in the right direction. The people, by and large, deserve credit for this, including the many who poured themselves into mutual aid efforts when the situation was most dire. The scientists who conjured these vaccines, who conjured these vaccines like magicians pulling a dove from a top hat, deserve a parade. as do the medical professionals who turn themselves into hamburger fighting this virus. President Biden also deserves a slice of the credit for this turnaround. The man may be about as inspirational as a bag of oyster crackers, and there have been stumbles regarding communication, but the change since January is nothing short of an astonishment. Given the sack of mayhem Biden was handed when he got the keys to the joint, his administration's ability to pull us out of the tailspin we were in will stand as one of the more impressive acts of leadership we've seen around here in a long time. That being rightly said, I still believe the drive to fully reopen and to forget is happening too soon. The green grass and warm springtime breezes can't alter the fact that while things are improving here, the COVID situation around the world is worse than ever. If something is not done about it expediently, we're likely to face what? Would it be a fifth wave, or are we still riding the first one? In any event, it behooves us to remember that the murderous Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 did a good deal of its killing in a third wave that came in 1919. The rest of the world is sick as hell right now, and in this regard, borders are meaningless. On Wednesday, a report emerged, which remind me, did I give you the date of this piece? It was June 3rd. So it's been a while. This is, been holding it for a while. This is the 12th. On Wednesday, a report emerged claiming that a vicious new virus variant had emerged in Vietnam. This one was actually a hybrid of the UK and India variants. I was an English Lit major, and the idea that two variants could meet up and make a super variant had never crossed my screen. Yet another terrifying COVID fact none of us can unknow. Fortunately, the WHO announced today that the virus rampaging through Vietnam, quote, does not meet the global health body's definition of a new variant, though it is still very transmissible and dangerous, unquote, according to the Washington Post. While this is welcome news, it is also a stark reminder that the longer COVID is allowed to burn, new and deadly variants will continue, and one of them might figure out how to pick the lock on our precious vaccines. Vietnam, Thailand, also Malaysia, India, South America, and now parts of Africa are setting the bar very high for the number of new infections per day, and their healthcare infrastructure is beginning to wobble badly. In Malaysia, they're heading into a mass lockdown that will last 2 weeks, and Peru currently has the highest COVID mortality rate per capita in the world. Quote, in Africa, concerns are growing over the possible arrival of a new wave powered by a more transmissible variant of the virus, with the health systems in many countries at risk of being quickly subsumed by a surge of infections, unquote, reports the Post. Quote again, a recent study found that the continent has the world's highest death rate of patients critically ill with COVID-19, thanks to limited intensive care facilities and reserves of vital medical supplies like oxygen, unquote. The Biden administration is moving to help these international hotspots, but there is concern these actions are not but nearly enough. Over the next 2 weeks, the administration will announce its plans to distribute 80 million vaccine doses around the world. That sounds like a nice beefy number until you remember the global number of infections to date is more than twice that amount, and 2 weeks is a damn long time when your house is on fire. The president has also signaled that he is in favor of waiving international patent protections for the vaccines, so countries can manufacture the shots themselves, This proposal naturally is facing strong pushback from the pharmaceutical industry and its battalion of lobbyists, could have added, and lawyers. Quote, the battle mirrors the one during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1990s, reports NPR. Quote again, when drug companies warred with global health officials who sought to produce generic treatments. Drug makers eventually retreated after former South African President Nelson Mandela accused the companies of using patents to profit from his country's health crisis. In this window of time when we seem to have a handle on the pandemic here at home, nothing less than a massive global Berlin airlift-style rescue mission is warranted. If Biden dickers around the edges of this and COVID makes another run on our shores, all the goodwill the president has accumulated will fall to dust, and my guy at the bodega won't be inviting me to remove my mask anymore. It's pretty nice out now, but as any Stark will tell you, winter is coming. It's time to stop talking about leadership. It is time to lead. The world needs our help, and we have the capacity to give it. Let's roll. The famous words from 9/11. Let's roll. Indeed, let's roll. Here's a piece from Common Dreams. Let me share the thing with you. From the new facelifted Common Dreams. This is by Richard Eskow, favorite writer of mine and live streamer. There is the day's light falls on flags planted to remember some of the over 220,000 Americans who died of COVID-19 on November 2nd at the Armory in Washington, D.C. The day before the election, 220,000 had already died, as we'll have occasion to notice as we move through this program. That official figure is now up around 615,000. And there are other measurements, such as those of the Institute for Health Metrics Evaluation and at the University of Washington, that are swearing to us that we've lost 1 million. 1 million dead. Our memory should not be limited to martyrs of war. This is from Richard, June 1st, 2021. Also, Richard is often known as R.J. Eskow. We walk with the dead, we aging ones. We spend time in their company. Mother, father, friends, enemies, all walk with us in memory. If memory is an electrical pattern in the brain, they walk with us in every moment. Some of us tune them out or try, but they are there all the same as music in memory. Steps on an endless staircase, a carrier wave in the human soul. And he says, a nation walks with its dead too. Ours is no exception. If it were, it would not have a holiday called called Memorial Day, unquote. As these words are written, the holiday was commemorated just yesterday. Remember, it's a day we tend to celebrate with a rather conspicuous absence of memory. As historian David W. Blight reminds us, it began as a commemoration by Black Americans for the Union soldiers who died under brutal confinement in Charleston, South Carolina, in a racecourse turned internment camp. But our memories should not be limited to martyrs of war. Our economic and political struggles have left more than their share of victims. from those killed by police violence to those who have died from other causes, from poverty, from healthcare industry greed, or from the addictive gains of the pharmaceutical industry. And now, because of the pandemic, we're approaching a milestone in mortality. The official number of American dead as of this writing is 594,000. That's an off-kilter number, one that doesn't stay in the brain or compute itself into palpable tragedy. It is not, in the words of Elvis Costello, a punchline you can feel. It is also wrong. A study by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the IHME, at the University of Washington, weighed other factors, including increased mortality from increases in mental health disorders like depression and higher use of drugs and alcohol, as well as decreases in mortality caused by social distancing and other causes. They also factored in increases in mortality caused by delays or deferment of needed health care during the pandemic, something that imperiled me last year. They concluded that there had been, Richard is talking about himself, something that imperiled me last year. They concluded that there had been 912,345 direct deaths from COVID in the United States at a time when the official figure was 578,555. The official figure is 594,000. If the ratios hold, that means the actual figure, as of June 1st, is now approaching 937,000. It's now June 12th, and will almost certainly reach 1 million before the pandemic ends altogether. I believe it's already reached about 1 million, because the official figure, at least according to the Worldometer site, is 615,000 now. 1 million dead. That's a figure to conjure with, a dark fate spelled out in political numerology. Here's something else we don't talk about. The dead have rights upon us. We owe them our memories. We owe them our respect. And sometimes we owe them our amends. That's true now. We owe amends to our million dead. They died because we were too easily persuaded, discouraged, or distracted from protecting them. We allowed ourselves to be misled by those who would rather see an ongoing parade of deaths than sacrifice their own wealth or power. In a good year, after all, tens of thousands of people die from lack of insurance. More die from poverty, from despair, from the indifference of a society that claims to value life, even as it traffics in death. Quote, God bless our troops, unquote, Joe Biden likes to say. Quote, God bless our troops, unquote, we say on Memorial Day. What about saying, quote, God bless our doctors and nurses, unquote, the ones who die trying to save others? How about blessing our teachers who showed up when others wouldn't, who bought school supplies on their meager salaries when you and I would not? What about blessing our delivery workers, our grocery store clerks, the mothers who went into work to feed their children even when they knew they could sicken and die if they did? What about blessing our old, who joined the ancestors among sterile machines without even the comfort of faces to look upon in their final moments? Our spirit of remembrance is as impoverished as our social contract. Who will walk with them in memory? Who will send blessings upon them? Who will recite their elegies or sing their songs, of mourning? Say it again. 1 million dead. Say it for them. Repeat it like a mantra, an invocation of those who died, but needlessly. Don't undercount them. Don't discount them. Honor your obligations to the dead. Sing it, say it again. Remember, but remember, and then act. You'll agree, I think, a very, very good and moving piece. At least it moved me well. Next, one more piece from Truth Out. Even with light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, we mustn't be complacent. This is by Busra Sicek and Daniel Falcone. Well, Daniel Falcone, don't know how he pronounces it. On June 2nd, 2021. Foreign policy analyst John Pfeffer is the author of The Pandemic Pivot, a report from the Institute for Policy Studies, the Transnational Institute, and focused on the Global South. This is from 7 Stories Press, 2020. In this interview, excuse me one second. In this interview, Pfeffer provides a framework for how a unified pandemic response could repair and restore social movements and compacts in helping to reshape the national and global economy. Daniel Falcone says, could you talk about the pandemic pivot and how the concept, format, and structure developed for the book? Also, could you share your argument and what you contend in the book? John Pfeffer says, the project started in the spring as the pandemic was developing and spreading. Around May, we at the Institute for Policy Studies realized, this is May 2020, I'm sure, realized this was a focal point in 2 respects. First, governments were responding to the pandemic in a systematic fashion, which revealed some important trends that are hitherto been either obscured or not remarked upon sufficiently, both on the positive side and on the negative side. Second, progressive activists were a little slow to respond to this phenomenon, both in terms of the severity of it and its implications politically and economically. But also, we failed to take advantage of some of the opportunities that presented themselves in an otherwise very terrible period. We wanted to get the reactions of activists and scholars and journalists from around the world. So we approached approximately 80 folks to participate in a project. We divided up the topic of the pandemic into 8 topic areas, and then invited experts on those topics of economic development, war and peace, migration and refugee questions, and so on. We didn't necessarily have an argument per se going into it, more of a rough hypothesis. This was an important moment globally that populist right-wing governments were taking advantage of the COVID-19 crisis by consolidating their political power, that the progressives should formulate some kind of response, both to the pandemic itself, but also to the right-wing activities around the pandemic. We held those discussions over last summer, and I prepared a transcript from those conversations. I checked them with all the participants to make sure their quotes were correct and their insights were summarized correctly. Then I used that as the basis for each of the chapters of the report. It was my job to flesh out these arguments The argument coming out of this is that the pandemic brought into relief many of the existing inequities, whether political or social, aggravated those inequities, and provided an opportunity for powerful actors of the world to increase their power. Now, by the way, this was actually predicted by people whose articles I covered back in February and March of 2020, when the CARES Act was passed. We were sure that its structures would contribute to powerful actors of the world increasing their power. And that, of course, is just what happened. Those actors might be the leaders of countries or of institutions like Amazon and Jeff Bezos, who are well positioned to take advantage economically of the breakdown of the global economy and the breakdown of traditional brick and mortar businesses in a quarantine situation. At the same time, some transformational possibilities will also reveal. So, for instance, obviously the climate crisis was very much in the foreground prior to the pandemic. But suddenly we had a very stark revelation of how a climate crisis can be addressed very quickly and very radically. We saw an unprecedented reduction in carbon emissions as a result of shutdowns of the economy. Animals returned to big cities and air pollution declined in cities because of the reduction in traffic. I have to mention at this point that now when we assess what the reduction in carbon emissions for a time, the impact that had when it comes to the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, it turns out that even this unprecedented reduction in carbon emissions has not had very much of an effect in reducing the additions of CO2 to the atmosphere. We now are sitting at a record, I believe it's 419 parts per million or 420 parts per million, okay, as measured in Hawaii. I believe the station K is on Maui. Okay, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's done at the Mauna Loa Observatory. But anyway, declined in cities because of the reduction in traffic. Here's another example. The major argument that was presented to climate activists prior to the pandemic was, quote, we acknowledge it's a big problem, but where's the money going to come from? Trillions of dollars are needed to deal with this climate crisis. Sorry, folks, but we're already leveraged pretty heavily in many countries in the world, unquote. Then suddenly, surprise, during the pandemic, the money is found to keep people employed, to deal with the consequences of the shutdown. We've been in financial crises or economic crises in the past, but this was something really quite different qualitatively and quantitatively. The financial crisis in 2008, 2009 resulted ultimately in about a 0.1 reduction in global economic output. Last year, the global economy contracted by around 4.3%. That's an extraordinary difference in scale between our current global economic crisis, which accompanied the pandemic, and the financial crisis. So obviously, there was a good rationale for governments to find money to deal with this unprecedented economic crisis. The third argument is that the pandemic really revealed how interconnected these problems are and how interconnected a transformational response must be. It can't be a return to the status quo ante, a return to business as usual, quote unquote, as it existed prior to the pandemic. I think everybody has understood at an intuitive level that this was a transformational event and therefore required a transformational response. And by the way, it still does, Joe Biden. How transformational and in what direction that transformation goes, that's obviously subject to discussion. Falcone asks, we spoke previously and you forecasted in a sense how globalization, quote unquote, the idea that globalization was slowing down, would impact and reach each social, economic, and political system throughout the world. Has anything developed with a radical difference since we discussed the pandemic last year? or even since you have come out with your book. People are talking, obviously, about the global recovery, and many, and I would say most industrialized countries have begun this economic recovery, complicated with certain kinds of speed bumps here and there. India was expected to have a much faster economic rebound and then was hit by a much more severe wave of the pandemic, the Indian variant, of course. Taiwan thought it was completely free of infection and went slow in terms of its vaccination campaign, only to be hit with its first significant wave of infections. And we will cover that a little bit later in the live stream. The situation is not so rosy for what are called emerging markets. Here we see the K-shaped recovery at a global scale. Of course, people talk about the K-shaped recovery at a national level. Here in the United States, where you have a class of people that have done pretty well actually during the pandemic, who have saved money or who have become pandemic profiteers. And there's a much larger group of Americans who are seeing a major setback in terms of their economic fortunes, evicted from their properties, losing their jobs, dealing with a huge amount of debt, etc. This K-shaped recovery is replicated at the global level. Some countries like China and the United States are emerging from this pandemic economically pretty strong. The EU is not doing as well, but it's not too bad off. I don't think the story is completely told in the EU yet. But then a number of countries have been driven to the brink of insolvency, including countries which hitherto had been doing reasonably well, like Costa Rica, for example. Those that had not been in such great shape, like Zambia, and countries somewhere in the middle, like Brazil, all of them driven to the brink of insolvency because of this pandemic, because of the collapse of commodity markets and the collapse of the global system that allows countries to export and grow their economies. But also, they took on a lot of debt to deal with the pandemic and the economic crisis within their borders. Globalization was a trend prior to the pandemic. It was largely a result of the declining rate of profits that were accruing to investments overseas, the vagaries of the labor market and demands of workers overseas for higher wages in places like China. And now comes COVID-19, which starkly reveals the fragility of the labor market. Couple that with rising costs of labor, and many global economic actors began to rethink the global supply. Well, the article says change, but I think they're rethinking the global supply chain. I think that's a typo. The pandemic has initiated a much longer conversation about the global economy and where it's heading, above and beyond the day-to-day decisions made by individual corporations. There's certainly not been any decision by any global authorities about what direction the global economy can move in at this point, but we'll probably see two kinds of actions moving forward. The first encourages some version of sustainability, which might include some form of greenwashing. If you look at, say, the extraction industry, which contributes quite a lot of global carbon emissions, not just in the burning of fossil fuels, but the actual extraction of the resources from the ground, greening that process includes making the actual extraction process produce fewer carbon emissions. Is that good? Is that bad? If it continues to produce the same amount of fossil fuels in the end, probably not so good. But in any case, this is one type of trajectory for the global economy, an attempt to make it carbon friendly. The second involves the circulation of loans. With so many countries on the brink of insolvency, the IMF, the World Bank, banks in general, and creditors have to think about how to sustain the global economy. There have been some piecemeal reforms like debt moratoria and increasing special drawing rights at the IMF. Debt forgiveness hasn't really been on the table. But here the trends could come together with debt for carbon swaps, where countries reduce their carbon emissions to reduce their debt burdens. We've also seen an acceleration, not exactly fair, I believe, but anyway. We've also seen an acceleration of some trends that we saw before the pandemic hit, which are more technology-driven. The pandemic revealed the fragility of the labor force. The labor force tends to be the most expensive part of any factory process. If you get rid of those workers, you reduce costs and you protect yourself from labor shortages connected to future pandemics. So automation is quickly going to accelerate it, and there are studies about how automation accelerates after economic crisis anyway. The International Labor Organization and World Bank produced detailed reports on how dramatic this automation might be, not just in places like the United States, but also in China and Ethiopia. This is also going to raise the question of what all these redundant workers are going to do. One other trend is reshoring, where transnational corporations make a decision that it doesn't make sense any longer to have your manufacturing facilities so far from their consumer base. So they'll bring that manufacturing facility back home, closer to the consumer base, and that would accelerate the globalization process. Falcone says the pandemic has created new norms. As disaster capitalism plays a role in intensifying inequality around the world, we also see new opportunities for resistance and advocacy. How has the pandemic reshaped the progressive left's ability to harness energy and get resistance movements to focus on class disparity and class consciousness? Can recent events surrounding George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, Palestine, and climate justice reduce addressing the pandemic pivot to class issues and struggles in a positive sense? The starting point for this is really the rise of right-wing populism and the appeal of right-wing populism to what had traditionally been left-wing constituencies like the working class. We certainly saw that with Donald Trump. Obviously, there's a race dimension here as well. It wasn't the black working class that Trump was appealing to. It was the white working class. But you saw this in Brazil as well, the pandemic. And this wasn't necessarily clear from the beginning, but it's certainly become clear over time. Remove the illusions that many of these right-wing populists fostered that they in fact cared about these constituencies. In Brazil, President Jair Bolsonaro engaged in a perverse version of the Bolsa Familia, the livelihood supplement for working families that former President Lula da Silva introduced by basically throwing money at people during the pandemic in an attempt to buy people's support. Ultimately, the failure of these leaders to have an effective response to the pandemic revealed to a lot of people, including working class constituencies, that these leaders, in fact, didn't care about their lives at all. Trump most likely wouldn't have lost the election if not for the obvious, palpable failures of his COVID response. I think we'll see other political casualties from the camp of right-wing populists because of their COVID responses, such as Modi, Prime Minister Modi in India. So this is an opportunity for the left to say, okay, you have been disillusioned by the right-wing populists' response to COVID. Now let's build an authentic left populist economic program that acknowledges what has taken place during the COVID era and build a better version. So I think we can see that the left has taken advantage and will take advantage of a new kind of economic possibilities within national boundaries. Transnational is another matter. I don't think we've seen an effective transnational program of economics. We've seen transnational movements on race questions, obviously Black Lives Matter, but women's issues like the Me Too movement, on environment questions. The pandemic either didn't sever those connections or actually created the conditions within which those transnational movements became stronger. Going forward, we have some ideas about what the left can do economically speaking. Here, the climate movement has offered some thinking about the economy that is largely divorced from the original Marxist or producerist roots of left economics. The climate movement is saying, quote, look, a producer bias has been the problem, whether it's on the left or the right. It has produced the same overconsumption and overproduction that has led to the environmental crisis. But in greening the global economy, we also have to think that this is our opportunity to close the gap between rich and poor folk. This is the opportunity for the global north to subsidize the global south's leapfrog over dirty technologies. In the past, the new international economic order offered a program for reversing the north's colonial extraction of the south's resources, but it never got enough traction. Now, actually, there is a self-interest among the industrialized countries to engage in this type of transformational economics, because we're all in the same climate crisis, and the industrialized countries cannot shield themselves from the economic and environmental consequences of global carbon emissions elsewhere in the world. And Busra Sechek asks, yeah, I was going to ask something specific regarding what you partly covered, but let's try to mention or highlight more if we missed anything talking about it. Nationalism articulates a lot of the renewed power that states have garnered through extraordinary measures given the pandemic. But before the pandemic, there was already a rise of far-right movements co-opting state structures. But as you know, history has shown a grim result from this combination. So what I'm asking is, what does the immediate future look like? And will authoritarian statecraft remain in place after the pandemic? I've talked a little bit about how the pandemic undermines some sources of legitimation of the far-right populists. These populists have basically three sources of power coming from their critique of existing authority. One is their critique of neoliberal globalization and the fact that globalization is not benefiting everybody. They have said, quote, look at how corporations and international financial institutions have profited from globalization, but so many people in our country have not, unquote. The pandemic has, in some sense, only emphasized that the global economy was not benefiting everybody. The second source of a legitimacy issue was a critique of the political elites that aligned themselves with that globalization project. That was also a very strong argument. After all, it wasn't just conservative or centrist parties that supported the neoliberal globalization, but also some left socialist parties and former communist parties in the former Soviet bloc that adopted these policies of privatization, reduction of government services, and facilitation of foreign direct investment, whether they liked it or not. The global economy was structured this way, and you either, quote, got with the program or went down the North Korean path. The right-wing populists said, let's drive all the bums out, left, right, they all collaborated with the globalists, and we, the authentic populists, never collaborated with the neoliberals, unquote. That's a somewhat weaker argument now because governments reversed some key elements of neoliberalism to deal with the pandemic, such as engaging in large Keynesian stimulus packages that have benefited populations. With the third issue, immigration, the right-wing populists made the false argument that, quote, we have to protect the authentic communities in our country, unquote. This took the form of white nationalism in the United States with Trump, or the alternative für Deutschland in Germany. But in India, Modi made the argument in terms of Hindu nationalism against the Muslims, while in Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made the argument against the Kurdish minority. During the pandemic, the immigration issue was largely off the table because countries shut down their borders. Right-wing arguments about the necessity to close borders became a reality in virtually every country. This took the immigration issue largely off the political agenda in elections. For instance, in the United States in 2020 or the Netherlands in 2021. But now that countries are opening their borders again, immigration will once again be on the political agenda. All of which is to say we have a mixed picture coming out of the pandemic for right-wing populists. They can make a stronger argument against the global economy, but a weaker argument about the national economy and what the centrist elite has done in response to the pandemic, at least from the vantage point of neoliberalism. But the real problem will be the return of anti-immigrant rhetoric. The loss of Trump in November is huge in terms of the United States. It will have an impact in terms of taking the wind out of the sails of right-wing organizing more generally. That's hard to say. For the most part, right-wing populists organize their support within their own borders. So the loss of Trump probably has not had that much impact. But I do think there can be a kind of, quote, we're in this together, unquote, spirit generated by the response of the pandemic that can substitute for the populist attack on the global order. And this kind of international solidarity, coupled with Trump's loss, can put the far right on their back foot. So Zizek then follows and says, where were we in 2020 concerning the progressive alternatives, and in which direction are we now heading in 2021 regarding, quote, working towards the international space, unquote, and quote again, the rejection of both the neoliberal status quo and the far-right challenge that will require progressive alternatives, not just nationally, but globally, unquote. In other words, can we still have hope? Hope is unevenly distributed around the world. Now we have a vaccine available, but it's not available to everybody. It's available in surplus here in the United States, where the government is begging people to get vaccinated, and states are setting up lotteries that potentially give people $1 million to get vaccinated. Whereas in other countries, including India, which is the largest actual producer of the vaccine, they're still getting hit hard by the virus, and vaccine distribution has been weak. So here in this country, we are very hopeful, but folks in countries that are still waiting on the vaccine are not as hopeful. Moreover, the uneven distribution of vaccines only makes the K-shaped recovery worse globally. In other words, countries that can't vaccinate their populations quickly cannot open up their economies as rapidly. It's like the tortoise and the hare. The hare can jump out of the gate very quickly because of vaccination, whereas the tortoise is going to fall progressively further behind as a result of this. Now, of course, as in Aesop's fable, the hare might become complacent and lose the race. So here in the United States, we have to guard against the kind of complacency and push back against the Republican arguments that we don't need such a big infrastructure bill or the other follow-on bills that the Democrats are preparing. Obviously, many people were very hopeful about Biden taking office. It was so bad for 4 years, just to return to what it was like 4 years ago is cause for celebration. It's a pretty low bar, but still, all the executive orders Biden signed in his first couple of days in office, there weren't that many, which effectively reset the United States to the last days of the Obama administration. No, they didn't, not yet. He's still issuing executive orders to try to reset us to the last days of the Obama administration, and he's not that successful. He's lagging behind in a number of ways in issuing executive orders to reset us back to those days. But anyway, we're a sign that the U.S. is emerging from 4 years of irrational leadership and has returned to some measure of internationalism. Yes, some measure. But unfortunately, we either have the same problems that existed prior to the pandemic, or they've gotten worse coming out of the pandemic. Carbon emissions, for instance, are rebounding back to new higher levels globally. A number of countries are now on the verge of insolvency. U.S.-China relations took a step backwards as a result of the pandemic. They weren't exactly in great shape at the end of the Obama administration either. But any kind of major transformational change at the international level has to include U.S.-Chinese cooperation. That doesn't mean, that the United States has to applaud what China does in Hong Kong or Xinjiang, nor does it mean that China has to applaud what the United States is doing in the Middle East. But it does require that there is a working relationship between two countries, especially on environmental issues. Same can be said about U.S. and Russia relations, which is experiencing something of a step backward in the transfer of power from Trump to Biden. The third issue, which is contemplating international solidarity, is the issue of hedging. The United States is an unreliable superpower. It has proven this over and over again over the years, but it's obvious now to everybody. It's obvious not just because of 4 years of Donald Trump and his unpredictability, but over the longer period in the political transitions from Clinton to Bush, from Bush to Obama, from Obama to Trump, and now from Trump to Biden. And how can anybody predict where the United States is going to be 4 years from now? Maybe it's a second Biden administration. Maybe Trump comes back. Maybe it's neither of them. But we have someone even more toxic than Trump, someone more competent like Tom Cotton. In any case, the United States has been seesawing back and forth in its policies domestically, but more important internationally, in terms of how it engages the international community. Other countries are saying, quote, thank you, we're glad you're back. We're happy you're back in the Paris Agreement, World Health Organization, et cetera, et cetera. But honestly, we cannot trust you. And as a result, structurally, we're going to change our policies to hedge our bets, unquote. So the EU has concluded a new economic deal with China It's going to continue to explore energy cooperation with Russia, which is not good because Russia is doing just fossil fuels. It's going to put more money into an EU military force independent of NATO. This is in contrast with China. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America may not like the strings attached to Chinese investment, but they know that China is going to be pretty consistent, even consistent in a bad way. Predictability is very important when you're making long-range plans, but the United States is very unpredictable. It goes beyond the U.S. government. U.S. civil society is also unpredictable. Some organizations call for greater cooperation with China around environmental issues. Others are calling for more sanctions against China because of its human rights violations, actions in the China Sea, etc. Going forward, when it comes to progressive transformation at the global level, for instance, on environmental issues, the real heavy lifting will increasingly be done by other countries because the United States simply can't be counted on given the profound political divisions in this country. Falcone says, are there any closing thoughts about the pivot, or do you want to say something about the book in closing that you'd hope my readers take away? One thing which has been a challenge for the left, certainly here in the United States, but one could argue globally, is that we are doom and gloom. We're always talking about the end of the world. It's not like we're wrong. The planet faces some serious existential crises. Part of this doom and gloom critique has to do also with the fact that in the United States, the left has been shut out of government. We have some people in Congress, but for the most part, the left has not been in a governing situation. So we're not forced by circumstance to put forward a positive program. So we end up focusing on critique, and that critique tends to be, quote, the world is in a lousy situation. It's getting worse. We've got to do something immediately, unquote. That might be factually accurate, but I don't think it's a great electoral strategy. I don't think people elect doom and gloom candidates for the most part. They elect people who promise something glorious. Obama's, quote, open change, unquote, or Trump's MAGA. There was nothing to either of those things, by the way. Nothing to either of those things. No one knew what hope and change was for Obama because he would never tell during the campaign. And certainly when he was president, was nothing like hope and change. And the same thing was true of Trump, okay, for MAGA. Nobody knew what he meant, okay, by making America great again. And no one saw him make America great again when he was the president. In the pandemic pivot, we talk about how the pandemic has aggravated a lot of bad situations, but ultimately, it's a hopeful platform, a platform that says there's an opportunity for transformation, and we're seeing signs of movement in that direction here, here, and here. Under the rubric of a more hopeful future, the book ultimately wants to inspire both activists and the general reader with accurate descriptions and forward-looking prescriptions, which I don't think we heard about in this particular interview. But this is a very good piece from the standpoint of assessing what impact COVID has had up to this date and what impact it had not had and what promises it offers. But of course, it's hard to see the promises when we're still coping with the continuing possibility of heavy impacts from COVID. Let's go now to the Worldometer site. We got to go there because we got to look for some minutes at what in hell has been going on. First, I'll deal with the overall picture. Then, I'm going to go to a few cases to talk about some cases. Okay, here is what did I do with this? What did I screw up? Oh, I see what I did. I reversed the fatalities per million. I had set it up right in the first place. Okay, so here's Peru. It's 1/10 of the size of population, of the United States. and it had 343 fatalities per today. That's like 3,400 fatalities, okay, in the United States. On a fatalities per million basis, it has been doing the worst in the world. It is up to 5,641. Now, I used to go over these statistics fairly frequently in months past, as you know. You never saw Peru there. It was never among the leading countries in the world when it came to devastation. By the way, they just had, okay, a new election in Peru. Looks like a Marxist-Leninist, or at least a Marxist, okay, was elected to head the country. It's a close election, though, and the right-wing Fujimori, but candidate, Keiko Fujimori, is trying to overturn it. She's 60,000 votes behind. She's trying to get people to recount votes. She's trying to do a repeat of Trump here to steal the election from Castillo. Okay. Now, of course, Castillo has been smeared by the right wing. God knows what's true concerning what they said about him, okay, what they did not. He won anyway. Okay, the election is reputed to have been a very, very clean election by observers who were there. But here's an election which everybody had to go vote the same day. There was no mail-in voting. There was no absentee voting. There was no prior. Everybody had to vote on the same day. All the people of Peru, in the middle of the worst period for them of the pandemic, where they have risen to the worst place in the world in terms of deaths per million, at 5,641 deaths per million. It's incredible. And they had to go vote, okay, on a single day, and people are celebrating that vote because the turnout was so high, and because something good happened, which was that someone who cares about the people of his country was evidently elected. So that's wonderful. But God, the community spread that is bound to come from this, I can't even begin to think about. I mean, that nation has just shot to the top of what has been going on in terms of fatalities per million and new cases every day. They had 3,000 new cases today. There, 3,000. That's like having 30,000 new cases here. It's a lot of new cases. It doesn't indicate that things are slowing down. Okay, Hungary, 3,103. Bosnia, Herzegovina. All these countries have newly risen to the top. The Czech Republic, 2,817. You go down the list, Eastern European countries hit very, very hard. Countries in the middle of Europe hit very, very hard. Even Slovakia, which had been doing very well for a while, the Czech Republic had been too, 2,277 fatalities per million. There's Brazil, up at 2,273 fatalities per million. Remember when Brazil was behind the United States? No more. They had 2,000 fatalities just yesterday. There's Belgium. Their death rate, increase in their death rate, has slowed down considerably, but they're still at 2,155, which, of course, that figure always goes up. And that's a horrific figure, 2,155. There's Italy at 2,103, another horrific figure. Here's the UK, with all its vaccination activity and effort. It's at 1,875 fatalities per million. It has slowed down. Today it had 12 fatalities. That is wonderful news. They're about what? We're about 4.5 times the size of the UK in population. So that's like having what? 55, 60 deaths here. That's great. It's really slowed down, okay, in fatalities. But still, it's substantial fatalities. Argentina is on the way up. They had 447 the fatalities. They have a population of 46 million. So, if you projected that up to our size, it would be something like 2,400 fatalities. I mean, they're still in the soup. But Colombia, okay, is in the soup. They've got 51 million people. They have 577 fatalities. They're on the way up. They're also in the middle of a political crisis as well, which civil war is tending to break out in that country again, in the middle of a pandemic where the tide has not been turned. We had 302 fatalities today. That, okay, is looking pretty good. A continued decline, okay, in the death rate here, each day that is. But of course, okay, the death rate over the period of COVID, in terms of fatalities per million, is also going up. So we're up at 1,848 now. But we've been surpassed now by all these countries, you see. We are now 20th in the world. If we just counted the really small countries, we'd probably be at 17th in the world or something like that. And we are falling. But we see a decline in the death rate in Mexico of late as well. Okay, but Mexico still has a pretty high death rate. They're running at roughly, if they were the same size as us, they would have had 600 deaths today compared to our 300. They still have some problems there, but their death rate has been slowing down. That may be due to the use of ivermectin in Mexico. We've been hearing that ivermectin has been showing a lot of use, okay, in Mexico. Okay, I'm not going to go over a whole bunch of things here because I want to talk about some cases. Okay, so I've given you kind of an overall picture. Yes, it's getting very bad in various places in the world. It's breaking out in new places in the world. It's getting more and more serious. Let's see which of these other things I want to pop up here first. Some of them will be the worldometer site again, but okay. I want to feature an article, this particular one. Okay, let me share this article. It's about Taiwan, okay, in April. That is 2 months ago. And you remember from other live streams I've done that at one time, Taiwan had a fatality rate of 0.3 of a fatality per million. They had something like 7 fatalities out of 24 million people. So this piece is from a media outlet known as Medical Press. April 16th, 2021, by Patricia Fitzpatrick from The Conversation. How Taiwan beat COVID-19. New study reveals clues to its success. Taiwan's been widely applauded for its management of the pandemic, with one of the lowest per capita COVID-19 rates in the world, and life on the island largely returning to normal. Just 11 people have COVID-19 in Taiwan. That was as of 2 months ago, since the pandemic began. An impressive feat for a country that never went into lockdown. So it was no longer at 0.3 then. It was at 0.4 fatalities per million or something like that. At the start of the pandemic, Taiwan was considered a high-risk country for COVID-19 due to its proximity to China and the frequent travel that takes place between the two countries. With a history of SARS in 2003, which was not considered to be handled particularly well, the Taiwanese government acted quickly to close its borders this time around. It set up a central epidemic command center on January 20th, 2020, to coordinate cooperation across different government agencies and ministries and between government and business. A new study in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, has examined further just why Taiwan did so well at conquering COVID-19. The study's authors from a range of health institutes and hospitals in Taiwan and the U.S. compared the estimated effectiveness of two types of COVID-19 policy in the early months of the pandemic: case-based and population-based measures. Case-based measures include the detection of infected people through testing, isolation of positive cases, contact tracing, and 14-day quarantining of close contacts. The population-based measures included face mask policies, personal hygiene, and social distancing. The effects of these policies were quantified by estimating the effective reproduction number of the virus, the R number. The R number is a way of rating an infectious disease's ability to spread, represents the average number of people that one infected person will pass a virus onto. An R number greater than 1 means the virus will continue to spread and outbreaks will continue. An R number below 1 means that case numbers will start to reduce. While previous studies in other countries have simulated hypothetical scenarios, this paper combined transmission modeling with detailed real data to estimate effectiveness. The authors collected data on 158 cases between January 10th and June 1st, 2020, from the Taiwan Centers for Disease Control. Yes, it's named after the Centers for Disease Control here. And all cases were confirmed by PCR testing. The data related to locally acquired cases, confirmed clusters, and imported cases in people who entered Taiwan before March 21st, 2020. Then compared the outcomes they found in Taiwan with an estimated R number of 2.5 based on the estimated equivalent number in nearby China at the beginning of its COVID-19 outbreak. Here was the winning combination. The study found that the case-based policies alone, like contact tracing and quarantining, could lower the R number from 2.5 to 1.53. Quarantine contributed the most to lowering the R number. Case-based interventions could not substantially prevent transmission from one person to another, but could reduce transmission onwards from those secondary cases to a third or fourth person as long as close contacts quarantined. Population-based policies like social distancing and face masks, meanwhile, reduced the R number from 2.5 to 1.3. The authors concluded that it was the combination of case-based and population-based policies, along with widespread adherence, that led to Taiwan's success in containing COVID. Combining both approaches led to an R number estimated using two different methods to be 0.82 and as low as 0.62. They also found that considerable population-based policies were needed to achieve containment, even though the number of circulating infections was small. Neither approach would have been sufficient alone, even in a country with an effective public health system and sophisticated contact tracing. What does this mean for other countries? Acknowledging that all models make assumptions, and this analysis is no different, this paper does confirm that the full suite of public health measures we have been using fairly consistently across the world to varying degrees of length and stringency have been necessary, though it's worth noting that the result in the study reflects a time when new variants with greater transmissibility were not a problem. The authors assumed that testing and isolation occurred simultaneously, This was the case in Taiwan, but not in other countries. For example, England, where delays between testing results and isolation diminish the effectiveness of case-based measures. Taiwan is an island nation with the ability to control the introduction of new cases through border control, and the authors acknowledge the finding of this study may not be fully applicable to other countries. This is the reason the authors focused on the effectiveness of case-based and population-based interventions on local transmission rather than on border controls on the number of introductions of COVID-19. The authors conclude that intensive contact tracing is not possible when public health systems are overwhelmed. This never happened in Taiwan due to the success of its strategies, but it did, for example, take place in Ireland in January 2021, which experienced the damaging third wave of COVID-19. This paper also found similar results for a 7-day and 14-day quarantine and suggests the quarantine period could be shortened. This is being considered by some countries, including the US, but it has not been introduced on a widespread basis to date. Maybe it should not be. We already knew there was much to be learned from Taiwan's success in preventing COVID-19 from taking hold. Now, as vaccines rolls out and new variants emerge, we have more information about the comparative and combined contributions of public health measures. We did as of April. Now we have more new information, which we will get to in just a moment. Let us now look at New Zealand. I want to show you some things in New Zealand. I have to share New Zealand, share the screen to show you. New Zealand, of course, is one of my favorite cases, as you all know. Okay. 2,702 cases in New Zealand, nation of 5 million people. Only 26 deaths. 2,647 people have recovered. The difference between 2,647 and 2,702 is more than the 26 deaths. That's because there are still some active cases. Active cases have continuously occurred in New Zealand, just not very many. Okay. I want to show you some graphs. This is a graphic of daily new cases in New Zealand. I'm going to put this on full so you'll just hear my voice in the background so you can see this better. Here, there we go. So the bottom is daily cases as of various dates from the start, of COVID. If we go back to the beginning, we don't see many new cases. Then we see, as of March 17th, the new cases rose to 12. And then we saw a period in which cases accelerated in New Zealand. And at the peak, they went to 146 cases. That was the maximum for any day. They fell back, but for a time, they're still heavy compared to what we saw later. 89 cases, 71 cases, 82 cases, and so on. Then the government got control by, let's say, what was this? Okay, let's say April 25th. The number of daily cases fell to 5. Well, let's say April 15th, they got control when it fell to 20. It became lower. But that's when they started really getting perceived as a nation that was successfully handling it. Okay. And when you look at the rest of the graphic, it's pretty low. Sometimes there are no new cases. It's actually 0. On May 19th, it was 4. Then it kind of went down to 0. Then it went up again to 2 cases. Most of the time, there were a few cases. Daily cases 1. June 24th was that. July 20th, daily cases 1. And there was a little spike again. The daily cases went up to 9, to 12, to 11, 13. A little spike again. Obviously, when they got cases, that when they saw a spike, they jumped on it. Absolutely jumped on it. You can see it from this graphic. You can imagine them jumping on it immediately whenever they encountered any sort of trouble. They jumped right on it. Goes up to 24 cases, April 8th, 2021. They jump right on it. They bring it down again to 4, to 2, to 2, to 8, to 5, to 6, to 3, okay, to 1. There it goes, 10. They jump on it. It goes down to 4. And the very last day, it's at 5. So you can almost see the government clamping down every time they get anything. They clamp down. These daily cases are, there's a daily case, 3-day moving average, a 2-day moving average. Here's a graphic of the active cases. You can see the active cases peaked 918 at one time in the early part of 2020. Let me move this up so you can see the months better. Yeah, in March, in April, it peaked at 929 on April 6th. It happens to be my brother's birthday. $9.29. That's when it peaked. After that, it started falling. And by June 8th, they had it low. Low cases. It goes up again on August 28th, 2020. They jump on it. They start to lower it again. These are numbers of active cases now. Not new cases. These are active cases. Numbers of active cases going up and down. They grabbed control again in April, and the active cases again started going down. The active cases ended in the 20s. Now they're 22, 21, 17, and then jumped again to 24, currently infected, out of 5 million people. With only 24 cases currently of people who are currently infected, that cannot overwhelm the medical capacity of New Zealand, which, even though it's only got 5 million people, pretty sophisticated medical establishment, pretty advanced, great healthcare system. Not enough people to overwhelm that healthcare system to respond and keep things down. Total coronavirus deaths, okay, in New Zealand, well, you can kind of see them going up. 0 deaths for a while. Looks like I'm going to be running a little over tonight. 0 deaths for a while. April 9th goes to 1. Then there's a spike. You see people die from that first wave where we saw the cases going up, shooting up. People died from that. Then on May 7th, 2020, deaths hit 21. And for a while, they remained, at 21. Then on May 27th, I guess on May 28th, they lost one person. So deaths went up to 22. Between May 27th, when they had 21 deaths, and now, they have lost 5 people. In this graphic, you can see it stays steady at 22 people for months till September. Then it jumps 24 people. Then it jumps to 25 people. And it stays at 25 people for months and months, and months, holding at 25 people, 5 fatalities per million. Then on February, I guess it must be the 15th, 2021, they lose another person. February 16th, deaths go up to 26th. And then between February 26th and now, no one has died in that country. They have not had the return, of COVID, because every time they get a spike, they jump on those cases. Every time they get a spike in cases, they just jump on it. You can see it from this statistical data at the Worldometer site. You can see it. You can practically feel it. So, what did they do? What did they do? This is important. There's a Wikipedia article on it. Background. On 12th January 2020, the World Health Organization confirmed a novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 was the cause of a respiratory illness, coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19, found in a cluster of people in Wuhan, Hubei, People's Republic of China, which had been reported to the WHO on 31st of December 2019. Case fatality ratio for COVID-19 has been much lower than SARS of 2003, but the transmission has been significantly greater, with a significant total death worldwide, they say. I should have started actually right at the beginning. I'll just go through this briefly. COVID-19 pandemic is New Zealand's part of the ongoing pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2. The first case was reported on 28th of February 2020 in New Zealand. As of 11th June 2021, the country's had a total of 2,702 cases, 2,346 confirmed, and 356 probable. 26 people have died from the virus, with cases recorded in all 20 district health board areas of New Zealand. The pandemic peaked in early April 2020 with 89 new cases recorded per day and 929 active cases. A total of 1,852,557 COVID tests have been carried out as of the 22nd March 2021. So in other words, about 37% of their population was tested for it. All borders and entry ports of New Zealand were closed to non-residents on the 19th of March 2020. with returning citizens and residents being required to self-isolate. From 10th April 2020, all people arriving by air had to go into 2 weeks of managed isolation in adapted commercial hotels. Now, evidently, Laura Ingraham thinks these are concentration camps, but they happen to be high-quality, luxury hotels, and motels. Travel from Australia opened up from 19th April 2021, and from the Cook Islands on 19th of May. A 4-level alert system was introduced on the 21st of March 2020 to manage the outbreak inside of New Zealand. Since then, after a nationwide lockdown from March to May of 2020, regionalized alert level changes have been used where the Auckland region has entered lockdown twice, in August to September of 2020 and February to March of 2021. So, they locked down. From March to May of 2020. They wanted to protect their people and to kill the virus. They knew locking down would do it, those social measures. This is not a totalitarian country. This is a democracy in New Zealand. To be completely truthful about it, it's a better democracy than ours. It is not bought. Corporations do not control the place. It is responsive to its people. It has a great healthcare system. Its citizens do very well on happiness indexes. Okay. I started reading in the background, so, I'm not going to repeat this. I'm not going to go through when the first cases were and the sick cases, and stuff like that. But what I want to get to is what was done. This gives you a narrative of what happened, on various dates. So it gives you a narrative of the statistics, which is useful. You have the link, and you can read through this. It's worthwhile, actually reading through it. So on 12th of December, I'm going to read this part. An Air New Zealand crew member who had earlier returned from the United States on 9th of December tested positive for COVID-19. By 31st of December of 2020, there were a total of 55 active cases in New Zealand, bringing the total number of cases 2162, 1806 confirmed, and 356 probable. Total number of that recovered had reached 2,082, while the death toll has remained 25. The case fatality rate is so low in that country because the way they have treated it. It's really low. On 25th of January 2021, New Zealand identified its first community spread case of COVID-19 since November 2020. 3 months with no community spread. On Sunday, after a 56-year-old woman tested positive for the coronavirus strain that is thought to have originated in South Africa. The woman had tested positive for COVID after leaving her 2-week mandatory isolation following her return to the country from Europe on 30th of December for work. By 31st of January, there were 71 active cases in the country, 69, in isolation, and 2 community transmissions, bringing the total number of cases 2304 1948 confirmed, and 356. Okay, probable total number of recovered had reached 2208, while the death total remained at 25. So this narrative is giving you active cases all the time, telling you how many are in isolation, how many community transmissions were in. They tracked all that stuff day after day. Every time there was a change, they tracked it. They tracked it. Responses, central government responses. The New Zealand government responded to the global COVID-19 pandemic by establishing a National Health Coordination Center. Remember, Taiwan did that too. In early February 2020, the government barred entry to most travelers from China in response to the global pandemic. In addition, the government sponsored several repatriation flights for returning citizens by residents and their family members, beginning with Wuhan in February 2020. In response to rising cases from overseas travel and within the community, but Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern closed the country's borders to non-citizens and non-residents on 19th of March 2020. On the 21st of March, the government introduced a 4-tier alert system, which placed much of the country's population and economy into lockdown from the 25th of March. Due to the success of the government's elimination strategy in reducing the spread of COVID-19, lockdown restrictions on mobility, social gatherings, and economic activities were progressively lifted on the 28th of April. So there was 4 weeks roughly of complete lockdown. Then they started progressively lifting restrictions on the 28th of April, the 11th of May, the 25th of May, and the 8th of June 2020. The lifting of alert level 1 restrictions on 8th of June eliminated social distancing and lockdown restrictions, but retained the border restrictions. On the 13th of May, government passed the controversial COVID-19 Public Health Response Act 2020, which empowered law enforcement to enter homes and other premises without a warrant in order to enforce lockdown restrictions. So New Zealanders tolerated that. On 11th of August 2020, the government reinstated lockdown restrictions following a second outbreak of community transmissions in Auckland. Due to the reduction in community transmissions, lockdown restrictions in Auckland and the rest of New Zealand were progressively eliminated on the 30th of August, the 23rd of September, and the 7th of October 2020. So that's the strategy. They have lockdown restrictions on a particular date when they get community transmissions, especially in a big city, like Auckland. And then they progressively lift the restrictions. In early November, the government required travelers entering New Zealand to book a place in managed isolation prior to traveling to the country. Mid-December 2020, the government announced plans to establish travel bubbles with the Cook Islands and Australia in 2021. So, you see the strategy. They use lockdowns when they have to. They're tough. They give lockdowns, alert levels. Following a community outbreak in South Auckland's Papatoetoe suburb, on 14th of February 2021, the government placed an Alert 3 level lockdown on Auckland and an Alert Level 2 lockdown over the rest of the country until the 17th of February, just for a few days. On the 17th of February, Auckland's lockdown was lowered to Alert Level 2, while the rest of the country reverted to Alert Level 1. On 22nd of February, government announced Auckland would revert to alert level 1 on that day, following new community cases that were connected to Auckland February cluster. The government placed an alert level 3 lockdown in Auckland and an alert level 2 lockdown over the rest of the country commencing 28th of February for the next 7 days. And then they killed it for a while, but they didn't have to do anything. They established some more travel bubbles. Okay. They've been doing genome sequencing there. That's a new tool in the government strategy to manage the pandemic. Ashley Bloomfield, in a press conference, I'm not sure who she is, but I guess I must have missed an earlier quote from her. But she said anyway, quote, "We're also doing genome sequencing on all those who tested positive in our recent current cases in managed isolation and in quarantine." David Welch, a senior lecturer in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Auckland, said, "Compared to the first outbreak when only 25 people out of approximately 1,000 were sequenced, mapping the genetic sequences of the virus from confirmed COVID-19 cases in a bid to track its spread is now an integral part of their coronavirus response. It is providing greater certainty in identifying clusters and helps focus the investigations of contact tracers." Bloomfield said that sequencing will provide information about how the outbreak started, and Dr. Gemma Georhagen, a senior lecturer in viral evolution at the University of Otago, who was working on genome sequencing with the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, said to Catherine Ryan on Radio New Zealand, "By comparing the genomes of the new cases to those from the isolation facilities, as well as the global population and other cases in New Zealand, we can begin to understand how long that chain of transmission potentially is and likely estimate when that virus emerged and first arrived into New Zealand." Right? A really sophisticated response and a real tough response, reinforced by local body councils in various parts of New Zealand. A very cooperative population. Everybody wanted to control the virus, to limit its spread, to limit its death, the death rates. They cared about each other. They've never killed the virus there. It's never gone away completely. But 5 fatalities per million, just a little over 5 fatalities per million. If we had managed this as well in the United States, we would be looking at 1,650 fatalities right now, not looking at 1 million fatalities right now. A government that was really serious about managing this virus could have limited our deaths to 1,650. There was another democracy that did this. It's not about whether you're a totalitarian country, okay, or whether you're a democracy. It's about how well you manage it. Now, there have been some international responses in criticism of this. The head of WHO, Dr. Tedros, praised New Zealand's response to the COVID-19 pandemic alongside other countries, including Cambodia, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Senegal, Spain, and Vietnam. We'll talk about what's happened in Vietnam very soon. On 28th October, on 28th October of 2020, Hoover Institution senior fellow Victor Davis Hanson criticized Prime Minister Ardern's requirement that people undergoing managed isolation quarantine be tested as a condition for leaving. On Fox News' The Ingraham Angle, while the show's host likened MIQ facilities, the isolation facilities, to coronavirus quarantine camps, quote unquote. Hanson and Laura Ingraham drew coverage from New Zealand media commentators, including the spin-offs Alex Bray, who compared their remarks to former United Kingdom Independence Party politician Susan Evans' remarks, likening New Zealand's lockdown policies to Nazi Germany. News Hub's Jamie Ensor responded that Ingram's comments lacked context, explaining that the camps were actually lavish hotels and motels. And if you read this particular Wikipedia article, which I urge you to do, there is a link to this article, so you can actually read this response from News Hub's Jamie Ensor. On 4th of May 2020, a high court allowed a man who traveled from the United Kingdom to visit his dying father, overruling the government's strict lockdown orders, including a 14-day quarantine for all overseas travelers. In response, Prime Minister Ardern asked Health Minister David Clark to review 24 cases where health authorities blocked requests by individuals to see their dying relatives on health grounds. As a result of the government's review, a woman was granted exemption from the mandatory 14-day quarantine to visit her 59-year-old terminally ill mother. On 19th August, the Wellington High Court ruled the government's message to stay at home at the start of the alert level lockdown for 9 days between the 26th of March and the 3rd of April was justified but unlawful and contrary to the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990. A law change on the 3rd of April made the lockdown legal. The High Court's ruling had come in response to a legal challenge mounted by lawyer Andrew Borrowdale. The Attorney General, David Parker, has defended the government's handling of the lockdown and not ruled out an appeal against the ruling. What I got to say about this is the actions of the New Zealand government were extremely decisive and extremely forceful, and were met with outstanding success in the bottom line of protecting the population from COVID. There was some freedom that was sacrificed in order to accomplish this. But there was also some freedom gained because the economy was not shut down for an extended period. People did not have to be masked for extended periods, for months on end. They did not have to stop seeing each other for months on end. It was handled. Every time community spread reared its ugly head, they jumped on it with whatever methods they had to use. And that actually protected the freedom of the people. It affected and supported their freedom to keep on living. It supported, however, and affected also their freedom to engage in economic life. Here are some of the long-term effects. New Zealand Treasury projected that the country could experience an unemployment rate of 13.5% if the country remained in lockdown for 4 weeks, with a range of between 17.5% and 26% if the lockdown was extended. Prior to the lockdown, the unemployment rate was 4.2%. Finance Minister vowed the government would keep the unemployment rate below 10%. In the second quarter of 2020, unemployment fell 0.2 percentage points to 4%. However, the underutilization rate, a measure of spare capacity in the labor market, rose to a record 12%, up to 1.6 percentage points from the previous quarter, and working hours fell by 10%. National GDP contracted 1.6% in the first quarter of 2020. The country officially entered a recession in September, In September, after Statistics New Zealand reported a GDP contraction of 12.2% in the second quarter of 2020. Second quarter contraction was led by a 47.4% contraction in accommodation and food and beverage services, 38.7% contraction in transport, postal, and warehousing, and a 25.8% contraction in construction. GDP rebounded 14.0% in the third quarter of 2020. On 4th November, Statistics New Zealand reported the unemployment rate had risen to 5.3% as a result of COVID-19, with the number of unemployed increasing by 37,000 to reach 151,000. That's as high as it went, 5.3%, apparently. Let's see if there's any more about that. Timeline. Alert levels. This is quite a comprehensive article. And you can see what the various levels actually entail by going through this article. It's really very complete about the response in New Zealand, and it's very constructive. It shows what could be done if you really want to beat this virus. So New Zealand, of course, is starting to vaccinate now, but they saved their people. There is more narrative here about the government response whenever something happened to threaten people. The Prime Minister of New Zealand had an iron will when it came to beating this virus. I mean, you got to say that. She has to meet some kind of international reward for what she did. Let's see if I can see some more. Has data here on the clusters, also identifying the various clusters that actually occurred in that country. And very good looking graphs, as well. There was something here. There's also all kinds of references if you want to go into the case, in detail, regarding what they did. So they had a recession. It was a relatively mild recession compared, to our recession. In late April, there was a ranking by Bloomberg. They had a COVID resilience ranking. They ranked New Zealand as the second best place to be during the COVID-19 pandemic, giving it a score of 79.6. While New Zealand had no community cases, slower vaccination rates has caused the country to drop in the ranking by 0.1 points. Singapore presently ranks first in the COVID resilience ranking with a score of 79.7 as of 27th of April 2021. As of that date, only 1.9% of New Zealand's population has been vaccinated. They did this without vaccinations. Without vaccinations. It's just an incredible story, an incredible performance. I'm going to stop. Oh, I didn't even share this with you. I should have shared it with you. Anyway, the link is there. I forgot to share this. Sorry. But I have to get on because this is taking a very long time. Okay, I think this is one of my better streams, but it is taking a long time. But I'm there. I'm there. Okay. We're going to start getting to the punchlines of all this soon. Okay. Here we are at Taiwan. Now you remember how Taiwan was the model for so long. 0.3 of a fatality per million. Look at these total cases. Total cases, 1,184 in the whole country. That's 24 million people. 5 times the population of New Zealand. Right? At the beginning of what happened to them recently, they were at 1,394 cases. They had been rising only very slowly all through the period of COVID, starting from February 15th, 2020. They only accumulated a total of about 1,210 cases by May 10th, by a month ago. Then they got this spike in cases. As of June 11th, they've gone up to 12,495 cases in Taiwan. Remember again, before the rise, 1,210 cases. That looks like it was about May 16th. No, it was on May 10th. Between May 10th and June 11th. They've had, 10,000 cases? Maybe 11,000 cases. Somewhere in between. 10 times the number of cases they had in all the months before that. Let's go down. Okay, take a look. Daily new cases going crazy compared to nothing before in all the months before. The virus got in, and they did not have the success that they previously had. We do not exactly know why. We don't know what failed in their system. It would be very important, to learn that. But for a very long time, they had been in the neighborhood of 9 deaths, 10 deaths. For a very long time. And they go up to 11, 12. Then, starting May 22nd, 17, 23, 29, 59, 78, 286. Deaths starting to go out of sight. That's the way it looks now. Between May 19th, and June 11th, in 22 days, their deaths have risen to 385 from roughly 15 deaths. So they lost control. Why did they lose control? How did they lose control? How bad will it get? We don't know. If we look at the fatality rate in Taiwan right now, and let's see if I can get the fatality rate. It's still something like 17 fatalities per million. It's still great. It's still among the best in the world. But their total deaths are just going up. And it's not clear that they've got it controlled yet. What do the examples of Taiwan compared to New Zealand show? What they show is that community spread can start at any time and can suddenly explode. And you don't know where it's going to end. You just don't know where. Here's Vietnam. They were another country. They've had only 58 deaths. They've had 10,241 cases. How many people live in Vietnam? 98 million people. Population-wise, it's a big country, getting close to 1/3 the population of the United States. They started having a problem after things were very steady for a long time. They started having a problem in January. Things started gradually going up. But again, May 7th, the cases start spiking. Between May 7th and June 4th, total cases go up to 9,900 and 80. Before the real bad spike, they were 3,000. Suddenly, in just a few weeks, they've gone up to 9,980. They don't have control of that yet. And you can see from the graphic that they don't have control of that. I guess you can't see because, again, I am not sharing this particular screen. So let me go and share that so you can see it in Vietnam. So there we are. You see the jump in daily new cases starting in April. Not as sharp an increase as we saw in Taiwan, but there's definitely community spread, and they definitely do not have it under control, and the active cases have been going crazy. They're now at 6,119 active cases as of June 11th. We're seeing this explosion happen right now. It is said that the Delta variant, which is the Indian variant, and the Delta variant I think the Delta variant, okay, and the Vietnam variant, because there's a new Vietnam variant. Oh, I know what happened. Okay, the Delta variant, okay, and the UK variant have now combined to produce, okay, a new variant, which supposedly is what is running wild, okay, in Vietnam. It is the Vietnam variant. That's what's causing the problem there. The same variant may also be causing the Taiwan problem. That variant has not spread to New Zealand. You can be sure New Zealand is going to be very much on guard against it, and it's not going to allow any travel. Now, so you have explosions in Vietnam and Taiwan, two places that had been enormously successful up to just weeks ago, and it exploded. Of course, both places are short on vaccines, but the new Vietnam variant is supposed to be 60% more transmissible than some of the earlier variants. Potentially, it's very, very dangerous. Now, I saw a comment here asking me what John Campbell has been saying concerning the variants. Last thing I saw of his, which was a few days back, said that he still thought that the vaccines would be effective against the variants, that there hadn't been any mutations successful enough to escape the best of the vaccines. So John is still holding out hope. John Campbell is also very cognizant of the advances being made by doctors in treating COVID when people get it through using ivermectin protocols. That's evidently had a substantial success now in quite a few countries, with data and trials showing that ivermectin seems to be effective. And with the whole medical establishment against ivermectin, because it's off patent right now, at least that's one of the reasons, and it's very, very inexpensive. Okay, the clinicians are very much in back, okay, of ivermectin. Hopefully, the combination of ivermectin for treatment and vaccines, but for prevention, and vigorous action by governments, perhaps will succeed in killing COVID, in getting it out of here, or at least stop it from this continual mutation that is evidently so dangerous. But we have to recognize that the longer the developed countries that have been so wedded to protecting these private sector patents, the longer this goes on, the greater is the possibility that we will have the development of a mutation that escapes the protection of the vaccines. and that we will be in a continuous struggle of trying to develop newer and newer vaccines that are effective against old variants of COVID and new variants, of COVID as well. One more post I have to go through before I end tonight. A recent, this appeared in Counterpunch. It was by Nicholas J.S. Davies on June 9th. A people's vaccine against a mutating virus and neoliberal rule. It's amazing how the continued survival of neoliberalism around the world is working with the vaccine to making our situations worse. A recent Yahoo News YouGov poll found that worries about the COVID pandemic in the United States are at their lowest level since it began. Only half of Americans are either very worried or somewhat worried, 35% about the virus, while the other half are not very worried, 30%, or not worried at all. How realistic is this? Oh, I'm not sharing this. Let me share this article for you. How realistic is this sort of attitude? I don't think it's very realistic, at all. For example, if we look at the United States, if we look at the United States, and let's see if I can find coronavirus deaths, in the United States. Oh, this is total deaths. I'm looking for daily deaths. Here are daily deaths, in the United States. June 10th, 481. June 9th, 506. June 4th, 556. 603, 512, 620, 651. Over the last month, we have still had something like 15,000 deaths. Now, the fatalities certainly have been going down. On March 11th, we were in the 1,600 range. April 8th, a little over 1,000. April 30th, 785. So we're going down, and that's looking very good. But if we're figuring that on a moving average basis, we're still averaging about 500 fatalities per day. We're still racking up 15,000 fatalities per month. And we don't know what the new variants will do. And we're still losing 15,000 Americans a month. That's 180,000 Americans a year if things continue at this rate. What happens if the new variants hit and spike us high, like they're spiking high now in Vietnam, in Taiwan, nations that had been much more successful than we in managing the virus? Here we go, back to the article. I think we should still be worried, very worried. But the news from around the world makes it clear that this pandemic is far from over. And a story from Vietnam highlights the nature of the danger. Vietnam's a COVID success story, one of the lowest rates of infection and death in the world. Vietnam's excellent community-based public health system prevented the virus from spreading beyond isolated cases and localized outbreaks without a nationwide lockdown. With a population of 98 million people, Vietnam has had only 8,883 cases and 53 deaths. So, in terms of deaths per million, Vietnam is still 53 over 98? They're still at 5 deaths per million, even though they just had this explosion, because they were so low before. But they're in an explosion. More than half of Vietnam's cases and deaths have come in the last 2 months. 3/4 of the new cases have been infected with a new hybrid variant that combines the 2 mutations detected separately in the Alpha UK and Delta India variants. Vietnam is a canary in the pandemic coal mine. The way this new variant has spread so quickly in a country that has defeated every previous form of the virus suggests that this one is much more infectious. The variant must surely also be spreading in other countries, where it will be harder to detect among thousands of daily cases and will therefore be widespread by the time public health officials and governments respond to it. There may also be other highly infectious new variants spreading undetected among the millions of cases in Latin America and other parts of the world. Yeah, how about those extreme fatality rates that we've been seeing in Peru and other parts of Latin America? Is that due to a new variant that has been going crazy down there? Or is it just the spread of the Brazilian variant that we already know something about and know that doesn't escape the virus? I don't know. Who does know? Does the medical establishment in Peru know? I bet the medical establishment in Peru is totally overwhelmed. What was that fatality rate, in Peru? Something like 5,900 fatalities per million? 5,800 fatalities per million? Anyway, this variant must surely be spreading in other countries where it will be harder to detect among daily. I read that already. A new study in the Lancet Medical Journal has found that the Alpha UK, Beta South Africa, and Delta India variants are all more resistant to existing vaccines than the original COVID virus. And the Delta variant is still spreading in countries with aggressive vaccination programs, including the UK. The Delta variant accounts for a 2-month high in new cases in the United Kingdom and a new wave of infections in Portugal, just as developed countries ease restrictions before the summer vacation season, almost certainly opening the door to the next wave. The UK, which has a slightly higher vaccination rate than the United States, had planned a further relaxation of restrictions on June 21st. But that is now in question. China, Vietnam, New Zealand, and other countries defeated the pandemic in its early stages by prioritizing public health over business interests. The United States and Western Europe instead tried to strike a balance between public health and their neoliberal economic systems, breeding a monster that has now killed millions of people. The World Health Organization believes that 68 million people have died, about twice as many as have been counted in official figures. Now the WHO is recommending that wealthier countries who have good supplies of vaccines postpone vaccinating healthy young people and instead prioritize sending vaccines to poor people where the virus is running wild. poorer countries where the virus is running wild. President Biden has announced that the United States is releasing 25 million doses from its stockpiles, most of which will be distributed through the WHO's COVAX program, with another 55 million to follow by the end of June. But this is a tiny fraction of what is needed. Biden has also agreed to waive patent rights on vaccines under the WTO's TRIPS rules, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. But that has so far been held up at the World Trade Organization by Canada and right-wing governments in the UK, Germany, Brazil, Australia, Japan, and Colombia. Yeah, the neoliberal World Trade Organization is a death machine. We've known that for a long time. People have taken to the streets in many countries to insist that a WTO TRIPS Council meeting on Tuesday and Wednesday, June 8th to 9th, must agree to waive patent monopolies. I don't know whether they've done that, but if they did, it's now the 11th. We should know. I'll try to find out. Since all the countries blocking the TRIPS waiver are U.S. allies, this will be a critical test of the Biden administration's promised international leadership and diplomacy, which has so far taken a backseat to dangerous saber-rattling against China and Russia, foot-dragging on the JCPOA with Iran, and war crime fueling weapons peddling to Israel and Saudi Arabia. Ending international vaccine apartheid is not just a matter of altruism or even justice. It is a question of whether we will end this pandemic before vaccine resistance, super spreading, and deadly variants fuel even more toxic new waves. The only way humanity can win the struggle is to act collectively in our common interest. Public Citizen has researched what it would take to vaccinate the world and concluded that it would cost only $25 billion, 3% of the annual U.S. budget for weapons and war, to set up manufacturing plants and distribution hubs across the world and vaccinate all of humanity within a year. 42 progressives in Congress have signed a letter to President Biden to urge him to fund such a plan. If the world can agree to make and distribute the people's vaccine, it could be the silver lining in this dark cloud, because this ability to act globally and collectively in the public interest is precisely what we need to solve so many of the most serious problems facing humanity. For example, the UN Environment Problem, UNEP, is warning that we are in the midst of a triple crisis of climate change, mass extinction, and pollution. Our neoliberal political and economic system has not just failed to solve these problems, it actively works to undermine efforts to do so, granting people, corporations, and countries who profit from destroying the natural world the freedom to do so without constraint. That is the very meaning of laissez-faire, to let the wealthy and powerful do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences for the rest of us or even for life on Earth. As the economist John Maynard Keynes reputedly said in the 1930s, quote, laissez-faire capitalism is the absurd idea that the worst people for the worst reasons will do what is best for us all, unquote. Neoliberalism is the reimposition of 19th century laissez-faire capitalism with all its injustices, inequality, and oppression on the people of the 21st century, prioritizing markets, profits, and wealth over the common welfare of humanity and the natural world our lives depend on. Berkeley and Princeton political theorists Sheldon Wallen called the U.S. political system, which facilitates this neoliberal economic order, quote, inverted totalitarianism, unquote. Like classical totalitarianism, it concentrates ever more wealth and power in the hands of a small ruling class. But instead of abolishing parliaments, elections, and the superficial trapping of representative government, as classical totalitarianism did, it simply co-opts them as tools of plutocracy, which has proved to be a more marketable and sustainable strategy. But now that neoliberalism has weakened its chaos has wreaked its chaos for a generation, popular movements are rising up across the world to demand systemic change and to build new systems of politics and economics that can actually solve the huge problems that neoliberalism has produced. In response to the 2019 uprising in Chile, its rulers were forced to agree to an election for a constitutional assembly to draft a constitution to replace the one written during the Pinochet dictatorship, one of the vanguards of neoliberalism. And that election has now taken place, and the ruling party of President Piñera and other traditional parties won less than a third of the seats, so the Constitution will instead be written by a supermajority of citizens committed to radical reform and social, economic, and political justice. In Iraq, which was also swept by a popular uprising in 2019, the new government, seated in 2020, has launched an investigation to recover $150 billion in Iraqi oil revenues stolen and smuggled out of the country by the corrupt officials of previous governments. U.S.-backed former exiles flew into Iraq on the heels of the U.S. invasion in 2003 with empty pockets to fill, as a Baghdad taxi driver told a Western reporter at the time, while U.S. forces and U.S.-trained Iraqi death squads destroyed their country. They hunkered down in the green zone in Baghdad and controlled and looted Iraq's oil revenues for the next 17 years. Now maybe Iraq can recover the stolen money its people so desperately need and start using its oil wealth to rebuild that shattered country, which of course would not be very good for the environment, right? In Bolivia, also in 2019, the U.S.-backed coup overthrew its popular indigenous president, Evo Morales. But the Bolivian people rose up in a general strike to demand a new election. And Morales, MAS, the Movimiento al Socialismo party was restored to power, and Luis Arce, the former economy minister to Morales, is now Bolivia's president. Around the world, we are witnessing what can happen when people rise up and act collectively for the common good. This is how we will solve the serious problems we face, from the COVID pandemic to the climate crisis to the terminal danger of nuclear war, humanity's survival into the 22nd century, and all our hopes for a bright future depend on building new political and economic systems that will simply and genuinely, quote, do what is best for all of us. Now, clearly, it's imperative that Joe Biden act very vigorously with his executive authority to facilitate the spread of these patents to all the nations of the earth, so each nation can manufacture a people's vaccine. I have to mention that if we don't do this soon, there may be time for Cuba's vaccine to appear on the scene. You know the Cubans would make that a people's vaccine and spread it to every place on earth, because they don't have any neoliberal system that they have to defend. In the meantime, though, let us hope that Joe Biden will not provide any more time for these dangerous variants to mutate and to spread before doing everything he can to get everybody in the world vaccinated. If that cost estimate of $25 billion is right, even if other cost estimates I've seen of $50 billion, $75 billion are right to get everybody vaccinated, that is what we need to have happen. The variants are too dangerous. And even countries that have successfully contained the virus up until now, so that it seemed gone in Taiwan, it seemed gone in Vietnam. It was not gone in New Zealand, but it was definitely and successfully controlled to a management level that should be the envy of the United States. Wouldn't we love to be sitting with 1,650 fatalities now? But even for the two most successful countries, Taiwan and Vietnam, the spread, the explosion has come. Taiwan is now begging for vaccines so they can get people vaccinated as quickly as possible. Let us accommodate them. Let our nation accommodate them, and not just them. Get it out to every nation in the world. Our government can afford it. We are a monetary sovereign. 25 billion, 50 billion, 75 billion. It means nothing to our economy. It won't even be going into our economy. Most of it will be going into foreign economies. If, and only if, we waive the patent rights of these pharmaceutical companies. Otherwise, if we spent 75 million, it would go directly into the pockets of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, doing absolutely no good there, except perhaps to further undermine our political system and move it away from democracy. We don't need that. We need the government to declare an emergency, to waive the patent rights, to get the technology over to other countries, to get the vaccines manufactured, and to complete the vaccination process of the whole human race within the next year. That's what we got to do. Let us not shrink from doing it. Let's see that it gets done. I know we have to get the Green New Deal started. I know people need Medicare for all right now. But what we all also need right now is to have everybody in the world vaccinated, the whole human race vaccinated, so we can stop these variants. We can't go any further like this, folks. Not handling this problem is just gross stupidity, as well as immorality. Where is the sense of morality of these people? Our government has the power to waive the patent rights. Let it exercise that power. Let it seize control of the factories of these pharmaceutical companies if necessary. Let them just be content with the billions they've already made out of their efforts. They've already made billions. They don't need any more. Kay says, shared. Carmen says, Asian countries have to use masks for decades now. States are trying to make masks illegal again. Some law residual from Klan days is what they'll use. I guess I'm going to jail, but I have too many COVID comorbidities. Delta variant is no joke. Yeah, the Vietnam variant is no joke either. What has Dr. Campbell been saying about these terrifying new variants? Stupid luxury cruises just won't wait. That's another thing. We got to shut down those luxury cruises to other places. That's got to stop. In the South, RSV is complicating recovery even more. Sorry, folks, what's RSV? Carmen says, how do you pronounce pyres? Pyres. Pyres. Funeral pyres. Kay says, I like Eskow too. Yes, it's ESKOW. And Evelina Aponte says, hi all, a protester in the UK reminded me, in the UK reminded the G7 that all vaccines were publicly funded with taxpayer money, and that while it's okay for pharma to make a profit, these need not be monopoly profits which limit distribution worldwide. Distribution. Peace has me thinking about Trump's COVID genocide, like withholding PPE production, especially to Democratic states. That was just... Trump is a criminal. What he did with COVID was criminal. Absolutely criminal. That is what it was. Argentina has been fortunate in being allowed to manufacture 2 vaccines so far, the Oxford vaccine and Sputnik 5, to distribute at a low cost to neighboring countries. It plans to manufacture the Chinese vaccine as well. It is working on its own vaccine, which would be ready for distribution next year. Cuba's going to beat it. I think the Cuban vaccines, if all goes well, will be ready for distribution sometime this summer. The Oxford AstraZeneca is a joint venture, with Mexico. Kay says, I think I might be a forever masker, laugh out loud. Evelina says, but laugh out loud, me too, at least for a while. Kay says, not seeing your comment. Evelina, Carmen says, global warming has stopped the raining season in its tracks this week. I've never seen that happen in Florida before. It's supposed to resume next week, but the hard pause again killed vegetation just as fast as it had sprung up. Kay says, I doubt we'll be ever done with this, to be honest. Carmen says, what will happen when all the green dies on trees and bushes and they no longer give off oxygen? Kay says, the way it mutates and comes back again and again as something totally different is not a good sign. Well, it's not coming back totally different. It's not totally different. It still seems to respond to the vaccines. Joy Burgess Ramsey says, hi, Dolores. Hi, Joy. Evelina says, it mutates because too many countries haven't enough vaccines. Yes, it mutates because of the vaccines and because there's no treatment for it, and because there are many countries which don't have a comprehensive program for treating it. Carmen Muniz says, oh, Biden. And Lana Dell says, I was out looking at houses, but a late hello. Hello, Lana. I've seen a few progressive posts that many Dems will not vote for any bill that doesn't include a lot for climate change. Hope they stick to it. Me too. If they don't stick to it, I don't know how they gain credibility back if they don't stick to this. They should just come right out and say it. They shouldn't even be hedging. They should say, if you don't have enough climate in this bill, it doesn't pass because we ain't voting for it. Evelina says, the far-right populists are active everywhere. In Europe, the UE establishment seems to be okay with it. In France, but for example, Macron is pretty permissive with the far right, yet stoking anti-Muslim sentiment in the country. Yeah, Macron's a right-winger. He's not centrist. Carmen says, Peru White Ring is trying to coup. I know they are. Kay says, even though my family doesn't pay attention to that, I do. They think I'm nuts, but they will have to deal with the mess after I'm gone. Carmen says, non-secular prayer for Peru. Indeed. Even it says East European countries, mostly with far-right governments. But Dr. Joe, no way Argentina has a higher rate than by Colombia. Yeah, you would think that, but the Argentina rate was really up there. It was really up there. Uh, let's and let us get that on Argentina. That song keeps going in my head. You know the one. Peru was 5,641 fatalities per million. Argentina is at 1866 per million. Uh, Colombia is at 1852 per million. So Evelina is saying there's no way that Argentina is worse than Colombia. Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I doubt that the statistics are as good in Colombia as they are, okay, in Argentina. I doubt that. I'm sure that Colombia is an underestimate. For that matter, I'm pretty sure Peru, the highest fatality rate in the world, going away. I'm sure that's an underestimate. Steve Gunn says, "Hi, you're all sorry to miss our chat. Been watching on my iPad. Can't comment there, you know. Fighting on can't comment on the iPad? Why not? Probably not enough memory in the iPad. That's probably what it is." Carmen Muniz says the UK is getting hit with monkeypox and it looks horrendous. My God, monkeypox. Uh, Anyone know what's going on with the Santance and the Florida cruise lines? I don't know, but I hope they're grounded forever. Evelyn says no. All I know is that the DeSantis is a JERC. And yeah, jerk. And Carmen Yunus says, last I read last week was that the cruises are caving to his genocide. Then everything went quiet. But I think two people caught it on one of the cruises. But I'm not clear if it was from Florida. Carmen says, sorry for my illegible writing, having a migraine. Sorry, Carmen. And Dolores says, I heard from a friend in Tampa, Florida, there's an influx of people moving into Florida from other states that support DeSantis' viewpoints. Oh, God, how awful. Dolores Pierce Barth is right. Sure, it's not the nice weather, laugh out loud. Evelina has two question marks. Steve Gonzo says, peace, love, and back to my pad, but I'll still be watching. So hashtag check yourselves, laugh out loud. Carmen says, before you wreck yourselves. Kay says, if we had a single payer, we'd have done better too. We need it now. Kay says, I talked to a woman from New Zealand on a diff chat, and she can't believe how backwards our country is. But New Zealand were inhabited by the British, right? No, they were inhabited by the Maoris. And the British basically colonized it. And then, of course, it became independent at a certain time. Still technically part of the British Empire. Still technically the head of state is the Queen. But, of course, the Prime Minister is really the political power in the state because they have a parliamentary system there. And Jacinda, by the way, wasn't even born in New Zealand. She was born in Canada. Sounds like New Zealanders aren't drunk with exceptionalism. I guess they're not. Okay, says before healthcare was privatized, Ohio used to be the best in the world. Not anymore. We aren't even in the top 10 now. Shake my head. And Carmen says, what good is freedom if you die from COVID or get long haul COVID? New Zealand had the courage to step on idiots' toes and keep walking. Yeah, they did. And Jacinda Ardern specifically had the courage to step on idiots' toes and keep walking. And she still has that courage. Kay says, wish I could find a doctor I trusted. Shake my head. Carmen says, I assume NZ is monetarily sovereign and can afford anything they need. They are. They are one of the monetarily sovereign countries, showing the power, okay, of monetary sovereignty. They have only 5 million people. Okay, and they, of course, have never run into trouble with their Medicare for All system. They have a Medicare for All system also, by the way. And it's very, very effective. They have a much higher life expectancy than we have here. People do not go bankrupt when they get sick. They see the doctors they want to see. Carmen says, NZ, damn autocorrect. Carmen says, if you study long, you won't be wrong. Evelina says, laugh out loud, embarrassing. Can't see your comment, Evelina. Did Vietnam celebrate a huge festival or something? I don't know what caused it, okay, in Vietnam. I think they're very careful there. Evelina says, I believe Vietnam is one of the countries Cuba has reserved vaccines for. Could well be. Could well be. Carmen says, thanks for the Campbell update. I have to do some Campbell updating tomorrow. And Lana says, isn't the newer variant more likely to be caught by young people or children? Yeah, that's what they say. Carmen Muniz says, Dor is being treated with ivermectin for vaccine reaction. Oh, wow. So he's going to tell us, what is ivermectin? I know it has been allowed but for emergency promises by WHO. Okay, it's a drug that had been used on horses for certain therapies and had been used on humans in smaller doses for very specialized purposes. It's been used in various ways for a very long time. It's one of the drugs with the least amount of side effects when it is administered in proper doses to humans. And if you Google Dr. Richard Kory, Kory, and also Dr. Bean, I think his name is Sobin Syed, actually. His last name is Syed, his actual last name. But he refers to himself, okay, as Dr. Bean. He has a wealth of live streams, okay, of videos on various concerning what's been going on, okay, with ivermectin. He deals with the scientific evidence. He does very often scientific articles on his show. He goes through them. He explains why they're important, okay, why they're not. He goes into statistical significance. He goes into statistical inference. He's very, very good. And also Dr. Richard Kory has been a crusader here in this country and other countries for the use, okay, of ivermectin. He's a clinician. He's really been getting static from the powers that be, okay, in the medical community But he approaches this with all the scientific evidence he can get. Certainly, okay, he's not a quack, and he has a lot of clinical experience with ivermectin now. And he works with a group of other doctors in a organization is called, I think, FLCC. Okay, and it's a group of doctors basically exchanging information, okay, in ivermectin and practicing clinically with it. Okay, there are meta studies of it now, supported with sophisticated computer software that show its effectiveness across a wide range of studies. It's only a matter of time before they break through the scientific establishment because their results are so good. It's far more effective as a treatment of the scientific evidence so far than say remdesivir or some of the things they've been developing, where the course of treatment costs a bloody fortune. Because of the monopoly the pharmaceutical companies have on these drugs. And there are many doctors in conventional establishments that are prescribing some of these drugs for either earlier or later stages, okay, of COVID, where the prescriptions are not appropriate because it hasn't been shown that those drugs are effective at those stages. And of course, people or their insurance companies are paying through the nose when the doctors are wrongly prescribing some new drug to treat COVID at the wrong stage, okay, of COVID, because that money is simply wasted then. Kay says, more money for big pharma, shake my head. Evelina says, emergency purposes. Carmen says, Americans don't see enough COVID devastation on social media or in the news and remain ignorant and in blitz. Kay says, let's go to Cuba. Will Cuba have us? That's still a lot of people, average 500 per day. It's a lot of people, yeah. And everyone's acting like it's over in the States. Well, in my building, they just took off the masking rules, okay, in my building now. Most of the people here are vaccinated, but there are 15 people, I think, in these two buildings that we have here for seniors. I've heard there are 15 people, okay, in the two buildings who, for one reason or another, weren't able to get a vaccine. I don't know if there are any who are simply refusing to take them for non-medical reasons. I don't know. But most of us here are protected, and the building is basically following the CDC guidelines. I don't know whether the CDC guidelines are justified, but given the fact that if the Vietnam variant hits here, and it certainly can, it can spread very, very rapidly. Very, very rapidly. And who knows whether it would mutate when it gets here further so that it goes beyond the vaccines. We just don't know what's going to happen with that. Carmen says, you just don't know if the U.S. reports are true. Even the CDC has been compromised. Corporations want workers to run out and die for their profits. They run the government. Very true. And Dolores says, ivermectin is a Food and Drug Administration approved anti-parasitic drug that is used to treat several neglected tropical diseases, including, onchocerciasis, helminthiasis, and scabies. One, it is also being evaluated for its potential to reduce the rate of the transmission of the rate of um, actually malaria transmission by killing mosquitoes that feed untreated humans and livestock. For these indications, ivermectin has been widely used and is generally well tolerated. Ivermectin is not approved by the FDA for the treatment of, I'm sure that's going to say COVID. And Dolores says, I learned of ivermectin from caring for different animals. Evelina Pont says, Angela Merkel said she's against liberating patents. How sweet of her. Well, the German pharmaceutical industry is very powerful in Germany. KRTD Media says, hi, Joe. Hi, Shane. How you doing? I assume that's you, Shane. Kay says, well, I need to go to bed. Thank you all for another great discussion tonight. I have very little faith that Biden do anything, to be honest, but I love you all. Carmen says, if the vaccines don't get shared among the world, COVID and mutations are going to be the Green New Deal because it will rid the offenders of the planet. Carmen says, great in-depth coverage about COVID tonight show. I feel enlightened. Thank you, Carmen. Lana says, some older people have up their homes and just go from one cruise ship to another. No joke. Have left their homes, yes. Carmen says, people are rushing to Florida to escape taxes, whatever that means. Carmen says, all credit to Jacinda. Carmen says, ivermectin is a parasite killer, isn't it? I think it's Mobeen. Yes, it is Mobeen, but he goes by Dr. Bean or Bean. Calls his followers cool beans, smiles. He and Dr. Campbell are great. Another is Dr. Hansen, but Mike Hansen. Yes, I think Mike Hansen is great as well. But Dr. Richard Corey is great when it comes specifically to the ivermectin. He is great too. So you should be able to find him on the web. He's really straight up. Carbon Muniz says, VZ has a mouthwash that kills COVID, if I remember right, from Dr. Campbell's show. What is VZ? I think I saw one show that indicated that actually a Listerine type of mouthwash is also kills COVID. It certainly reduces the viral load in the mouth from COVID if you happen to have it. Lana says, correction, some older people gave up their homes, re-cruise ships. Evelina says, oh well, Argentina's been using that serum for horses for treatment. I wonder if it's similar to the ivermectin. I think I've heard they are using ivermectin in Argentina. You can probably simply Google that and it will come up. I think they're one of the countries that's been trying ivermectin. I think they've been trying it in Mexico too, and I think they've been having considerable success in Mexico. And Dolores says, yes, ivermectin is a parasite killer. Carmen says India is making unvaccinated people wear skull and bone symbols, I guess, to warn others. Venezuela. So Carmen says Venezuela has a mouthwash that kills COVID. That's very interesting because the fatality rates in Venezuela are fairly low, actually surprisingly low, making one wonder Venezuela But whether Venezuela has been screwing with their statistics in some way, because they do have a fairly low fatality rate. It is actually 99 per million, which these days is a fairly low fatality rate. They're 134th, okay, in the world. They're just a little higher than Cuba. That is, okay, at 95. Also, there are Cuban doctors, okay, in Venezuela, helping them out, okay, at this point. Just some facts. Okay, Venezuela is doing pretty well compared to other countries. Like, clearly, they've been doing 18 times better than the United States, for example. Okay, Venezuela. And Carmen says that L-glutathione, I guess it's L-glutathione, stops those COVID storms. It does? Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you, Carmen. And that's the last comment. So I'm going to say good night, folks. I've now been here for 3 hours. I have to admit that I've enjoyed it very much. I think the message, okay, is an important one. Be careful. Be very, very careful. Jump on it. Control it. Don't worry about the crazies. Just do your job. To the politicians, do your jobs. Protect people's lives. That's the first thing you're supposed to do. This can be managed. You can get down to 5 deaths per million. But you got to do what New Zealand actually did. Carmen says, sweet dreams. Yes, staying was worth it. We'll buy more hand sanitizer. We still have some hand sanitizer, yet there's no shortage of hand sanitizer right now. But I think that masks may well be back soon. And I'm certainly going to wear them when I go into stores, for the most part. I'm certainly going to wear them when I'm in crowds. I'm certainly going to have them with me. I'm certainly going to watch out very carefully for whether the Vietnam variant is getting into this country. I don't know how they're going to stop it, because they're opening up the country to the world again, because they think they've beaten it with the virus. With the vaccines. I don't think so. Anyway, good night before I launch into another hour.